Hello, welcome to our ongoing discussion of Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. Today I'm going to pick up with Chapter 4, the so-called dependency complex of the colonized. I think this is a really important chapter, so I'm going to spend a little time on it because it will sort of reflect back and further elucidate some things that had gone on in the previous two chapters about the interracial relationships between black men and white women and black women and white men. So this so-called dependency complex is really significant. Here, Fanon takes up this Manoni, Prospero and Caliban, the psychology of colonization. So Manoni's book, Prospero and Caliban, is named after characters from Shakespeare's Tempest. And he uses these literary archetypes to paint a kind of naturalized picture of the colonized peoples and the colonizers. And the primary discussion in that text that Fanon picks up on concerns mostly the indigenous peoples of Madagascar, or the colonized peoples of Madagascar, the Malagasy. So the thesis that Fanon wants to sort of pick apart, while acknowledging that some of Manoni's analysis is apt. I mean, Fanon does acknowledge that there are some strengths to understanding this dependency, and certainly colonized peoples, wherever they are made to be dependent upon the colonized. The big problem with the text that Fanon really criticizes, and against which Fanon builds his own views, is that there's a natural tendency toward dependency in colonized peoples, and that they have this inborn slave nature. I mean, that's the way that Aristotle sort of saw it, right? That people are sort of naturally born to be slaves, and that they desire basically the white people to come and provide them with sort of leadership and a kind of order that they're lacking in their society. So this is most clear when Fanon picks up on Manoni's analysis of these myths that people will come from the sea and so on. So the way that Manoni reads that is that the colonized people and indigenous peoples around the world are waiting, that they sense the lack in themselves, and they have a need for some other to come upon whom they can be dependent, and that will give them the gift of civilization, all this kind of stuff, that they'll be rescued from their so-called primitive state and elevated by these foreigners who come from the sea, or whatever the case may be. So Manoni attributes this sort of subconscious desire to be dominated by someone upon whom you can be dependent to save you from your more animalistic state as a natural feature of the psychological makeup of colonized peoples. Now, of course, this is used to justify colonization, and I think one of the most poignant things that Fanon says about this is it creates a convenient excuse, of course, for the colonizers. They don't actually have to attribute the kindness and the openness of indigenous peoples to foreigners, to any kind of humanity or generosity or anything like that, a goodwill, to use Kant's language. Because that, of course, would be to acknowledge their equal humanity. If we begin to attribute these humane characteristics to indigenous people, then the colonizer risks humanizing them too much. The myth of dependency, on the other hand, makes the colonizer out to be kind of like a good guy. The indigenous people, the colonized ones, need someone on whom to be dependent, and the white person can step forward and fulfill that role for them. So it's in the colonized own best interest. And of course, Fanon thinks that this is a very convenient thing. Isn't it the case that indigenous peoples are open and receptive to foreigners actually on the basis of their humanity? And it's only after the arrival of the colonizer that they then begin to question their humanity. Right? So this is what Fanon is pushing back against, and he takes up arguments against Mannoni throughout this chapter, and again uses that to develop his own position. European civilization and its agents of the highest caliber are responsible for colonial racism. He says, every time we see an Arab with that hunted, evasive look of distress, draped in those long, ragged robes that seem to have been made for him, we tell ourselves that Monsieur Mannoni was wrong. How many times have I been stopped in broad daylight by the police, who took me for an Arab, and when they discover my origins, they hastily apologize. We know full well a Martinican is different from an Arab. I would protest violently, but I was told, you don't know them. Truly, Monsieur Mannoni, you are wrong. It's not the few, the work of the few, that institute colonialism, as Fanon says, meaning Mannoni means that colonialism is the work of adventurers and politicians, and the best representatives of white European culture keep themselves above the fray. But again, he rejects that. It's the whole social structure. It's not just a few bad apples, a few adventurers. The whole structure of colonialism, again, colonialism as a system, which then implicates everybody up into it. Because when the system of colonialism comes into an area, it creates the category of the native in order to marginalize. Remember Fanon's analysis of language and how language carves people up and separates them and places them into these different classes, which is used in the legal framework of the colony and so on and so forth, right? So this is what makes it impossible for the black woman to be accepted within the white social milieu, all of this, all of these kind of dynamics, right? So it's the system that's implemented that's racist. That's the problem. It's not just a few bad actors. And the system is the same in South Africa, in Algeria, in Vietnam, in the American South, whatever the case may be. There's not some great distinction between these two. Because, French colonial people will often say things like, well, it's not as bad as in the American South and that kind of thing. And Fanon rejects that he rejects the disanalogy there, that no, actually these systems are the same and their effects are generally the same. He says very clearly that he says that Mannoni has forgotten that the Malagasy no longer exists. He has forgotten that the Malagasy exists in relation to the European. When the white man arrived in Madagascar, he disrupted the psychological horizon and mechanisms. As everyone pointed out, alterity for the black man is not the black but the white man. An island like Madagascar, invaded from one day to the next by the quote-unquote pioneers of civilization, even if these pioneers behaved as best they could, underwent destructuralization. And Mannoni says as much, right? The arrival of the white man in Madagascar inflicted an unmistakable wound. The consequence of this European eruption in Madagascar are not only psychological, since, as everyone has said, there are interrelationships between consciousness and social context. So it changes the structure. The next page continues and really draws this point out most explicitly. Once again, we find the same misunderstanding on the part of Mannoni. It is in fact obvious that the Malagasy can perfectly bear not being a white man. A Malagasy is a Malagasy, or rather, he is not a Malagasy, but he lives this Malagassyhood. If he is a Malagasy, it is because of the white man, and if, at a certain point in his history, he has been made to ask the question whether he is a man, it is because his reality as a man has been challenged. In other words, I start suffering from not being a white man insofar as the white man discriminates against me. turns me into a colonized subject, robs me of any value or originality, tells me I am a parasite in the world, that I should toe the line of the white world as quickly as possible, and that we are brute beasts, that we are a walking manure, a hideous forerunner of tender cane and silky cotton, that I have no place in the world. So I will try, quite simply, to make myself white. So in the indigenous position, in the aboriginal position, it's basically assumed that the colonized are humans. They are the people, and they treat each other accordingly, and they live their humanness. They don't have need to distinguish themselves particularly as Malagasy, as distinct from European, or so on and so forth. They live in a state of an assumed humanity. It's only on the introduction of the colonizing people, the white European in this case, who confront the native population with whiteness, that their humanity is then thrown into question, because the European power is coming in with its dominating force and saying, no, we are the people and you are the other ones, you are the less than human, and so on and so forth. So now the humanity is thrown into question. Think again of the importance of the question in Beauvoir and Sartre. When something becomes questionable through its negation, right, it's something that then you have to justify, and you have to justify it in front of the eyes of the other. So now suddenly the indigenous population, or the Malagasy, or the Arabs in North Africa, are being forced to justify themselves as human for the first time. Before, they could, amongst themselves, in their own society together, assume each other's humanity. But now, faced with this invasion, they're thrown into the position of having to justify their humanity in the eyes of the people who would oppress them, which again, of course, creates a conflict. The same conflict we saw in the last two chapters about those romantic and sexual relationships, and the impossibility of really achieving whiteness through those sorts of games, those psychosexual games. Because the only people who can grant you humanity, because of the power imbalance between you, are exactly the same people whose interests it serves to deny your humanity. And so the inferiority complex that Fanon is discussing arises exactly because of this. This is Fanon's ultimate argument here, that it's not some natural instinct within the colonized people. It's not a natural instinct for the dispossessed black woman to chase after a white man for social status. It's not a natural instinct for a black man to seek a white woman to validate his humanity through association with her, through conquering her sexually or something like that. It's not in the indigenous population's nature to be dependent. This kind of dependency emerges out of the context of the colonial situation and the power dynamics that get inscribed therein, and the way that the language comes to dominate it. In the original language of the indigenous people, they treat each other like humans, and that's how they talk amongst each other and about each other. When the linguistic structure of colonialism comes to dominate, and that is the system of signs that come to dominate the social relationships between people, when they have to trade in that symbolic language in order to negotiate their social relationships with one another, this is when the inferiority complex arises, because they're having to navigate a foreign symbolic order that has dispossessed them and put into question their very humanity. Right. So none of this is natural or inevitable or anything like that. It's a product of the context and the situation, the material conditions that's being imposed with the social order, as well as the symbolic order that accompanies that material arrangement through language and that kind of thing. So I think Fanon is really important, points out something really important when he talks about how all of this sort of symbolism in the language and the dream has to be contextualized. It doesn't exist in some sort of vacuum, abstractly independent of real people and their lived situation and their context and historical precedent and future plans and all of that kind of stuff. Why is it that in their dreams, some of these people who are identified as black fear other black people? Well, the way that they've been pitted against each other, the way the Senegalese is used to torture, this horrible footnote that describes the torture at the hands of these Senegalese police that have been drafted into the service of the colonial powers, and so on. The simulated drowning, again, connection to like waterboarding today, and that kind of stuff. The summary, I think, is very clear here, right? If we add that many Europeans set off for the colonies because they get rich over there in a very short time, and that, with rare exceptions, the colonial is a trader, or rather a trafficker, you will have grasped the psychology of the man who produces the feeling of inferiority in the native. As for the dependency complex of the Malagasy, at least in the sole form in which we can understand and analyze it, it too originates with the arrival on the island of the white colonizers. So Fanon feels by the end he has pretty conclusively rejected the thesis of Fanon just through the psychological evidence that he's provided from his own clinical practice, as well as his analysis and refutation of the points provided. He provides this alternative analysis to Fanon there. The white European arrives asserting their dominance and superiority and wielding material power in order to sway the population. And so again, this creates these sorts of dichotomies wherein inferiority can be glimpsed and attributed to the native population or the indigenous population. Right? So again, you can see a couple of things going on that I think clearly marks out the project that Fanon is engaged with here as existential. There's a movement from the subjective sphere, the psychological analysis that Fanon's doing, to the material conditions and back again. Those two are deeply intertwined for Fanon. Psychological phenomena doesn't occur in some abstract vacuum, but is always connected to the material conditions. So we have this movement from the subjective to the objective sphere, from the psychological to the material economic conditions, and so on. You also have a movement from the individual to the collective. And so he's using encounters that he has with individuals who talk about their psychological issues and the way that they're thinking about things with particular texts, such as Fanon's, and moving from those sort of individual encounters, which he collects sort of examples of, that's his sort of data set in a way, to talk about the system as a whole that shapes those. So moving back and forth between the sort of individual and the collective sphere also, I think. Again, that's a standard thing that existentialism attempts, to sort of thread that needle or pass through that gap between the individual and the collective. That's something that's always forefront in the minds of not just Fanon, but also Sartre, and Beauvoir says as much explicitly in her short essay, What is Existentialism? So I think that particular chapter is really important, and the way that he responds to Fanon really fleshes out some key themes that have been building up in the book, especially through those last two chapters that we covered in the previous video. So in my mind, this chapter really brings a lot of light and illuminates the general project that Fanon is working on and how it fits in the existentialism sort of more broadly. You also find, I think, here that Fanon is helping to establish and participating in a general argument that we see, for instance, in Beauvoir's The Second Sex, that certain things are presented as being natural, the dependency of one set of people on another, for instance, or the inferiority of one group of people. And what's actually happening is that that dependency is created by the historical, economic, social context. It's not a natural phenomenon. So you have the generation of a social situation, of the material conditions that create certain classes of people, certain people subject to these situations and so on. And then people in positions of power survey the social conditions, turn around and say, oh yes, of course, this is natural. And so the Malagasy is fit to be nothing better than a servant, because that's the natural position, rather than recognizing that it's the situation that's been created for them by the activities of people in history and so on, right? The supposed naturalism is false. This is something Beauvoir also says in The Ethics of Ambiguity, that the people will hide behind naturalness in order to justify their oppression, the oppression of others, rather. They'll justify oppression by cloaking it in the language of naturalness and so on, like it's inevitable. Why would one rebel against nature, right, she says. So Fanon is, again, helping to develop and participating in a very similar argumentative strategy in this chapter that you find pretty widespread throughout this kind of work in anti-colonialism. And again, it's this push back against naturalizing these positions as a way to justify them. So that's really important to note, and it comes out really clearly in that chapter 4 of Black Skin, White Masks, okay? So having sort of drawn attention to that, I'm going to leave this video here, and we will move into the next chapter in subsequent videos. So thanks for following along with me, and I will see you in the next video.